Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rania, Khalek. Hey, Rania. How's it going?
Not bad. How you doing, Kevin?
And so we're very pleased to have back on our show Matt Kennard, who is a chief investigator for Declassified UK. But for this show, we're also speaking to him about a book he co-authored, project called Silent Coup, How Corporations Overthrew Democracy. That's something that we're all experiencing the impacts of. You chronicle as you travel around the world the different aspects of corporate control of this planet. I think we feel it very viscerally. I'm feeling it really intensely today in the States because we just jammed through a pipeline for a corporation in the United States on behalf of a senator named Joe Manchin. Because if we didn't, our country was going to default economically. So they used the debt ceiling as a way to get this through when they couldn't have in any other way in Congress. And there are tons of examples in your books of the corporations throughout the world manipulating these processes so that they can get what they want. So thank you for joining us, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
So, the first question, I suppose, you have this organized thematically, which as somebody who just put together a book, I have to say that I'm in favor of that. I think it's, far better rather than to just do a raw chronology from, 1800s, 1900s, wherever you want to start through to the present. I think it's easier for people to understand something that's as sprawling as this topic to break it down. So you have it as like corporate armies, corporate justice, corporate aid and welfare, and you break it down into these different topics, which we'll be touching upon in this conversation. But maybe I always like to begin broadly so that we can hit whatever specific areas you would like to hit. So when you call it the silent coup, I think everybody has felt the control of corporations over their lives, but what do you mean when you call it a silent coup?
Well, effectively, it means that corporations have their hands now on the levers of political power, but it hasn't been a coup, say, like Pinochet in Chile in 1973, or how we imagine a military coup where storming of the palace, the military takes over and a dictator takes over. It's been done in a very undercover, secretive way, but very consciously by different power interests, primarily in the corporate sector, but also allied to governments often. And just to go back to your introduction, the reason we broke it down like this was a huge reporting project. We did it over 2 or 3 years, and we had got a fellowship at the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London, which was actually then run by a guy called Gavin McFadden, who was the political mentor and journalistic mentor to Julian Assange, but also, it's not really well known about, but also young Bernie Sanders in Chicago in the 1960s. So this was a very important figure, but not many people know about him. He died in 2016, but effectively he gave us these fellowships, and the book is co-authored with Claire Provost, who left The Guardian to take this fellowship. I'd previously been at the Financial Times. And we started this fellowship, and we both talked about what the biggest issues of the day globally were. Because we had the chance to do something really ambitious, because Gavin was a bit of an anarchist. So he just sort of said, you have 2 years to do whatever you want, and you've got a travel budget. Use it wisely. That was basically all he said. So we said, we might as well be as ambitious as possible. And we agreed that corporate power and the corporate coup, i.e. the taking over of the state and a construction of different mechanisms through which they can exert their will on the political systems domestically all over the world, but also internationally, was the major issue of the day. And Claire had actually been working on a particular system, which I think is emblematic of this coup. And this is called the Investor State Dispute Settlement System, or ISDS. I don't know how many of your listeners will have heard of it, but they're going to hear about it more and more, because this was a legal system that was set up in the 60s to allow corporations to sue states for enacting policies they don't like. So we thought that was a good way in. So we started the first trip we did, and we went to 25 countries eventually on 5 continents. First trip we did was to El Salvador, because there was a case where a Canadian mining company had taken El Salvador to court because it hadn't granted them an environmental permit and was suing them for $300 million, which was a huge amount of money for El Salvador, which is a small and poor country. They were suing them at a place called the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, or ICSID, which is an arm of the World Bank that was set up in 1966. It's the primary venue where these cases are heard. But as we did the reporting for that, we sort of saw that this was part of a supranational system of governance that corporations had built in the period when formal empires were crumbling to ensure that their interests were preserved when they couldn't have formal mechanisms of control on the developing world, so garrisons of troops or whatever it is. In formal empire, you had satraps that did your bidding in the developing world. They didn't have that anymore, and they were thinking, how are we going to maintain our control and maintain our interests? The ISDS system is an emblematic example of that, but it's not the only one. So we went around the world. We also went to South Africa because there was a case there, which was probably the craziest case we looked into, where after the fall of apartheid in the 90s, the post-apartheid government of Mandela instituted, and subsequent governments instituted, black empowerment policies, which were about rectifying the historical injustices. One of the facet of that was companies had to give a certain percentage, I think it's like 30% of their companies, to historically disadvantaged people in South Africa, so black people. Now, an Italian granite company didn't want to do that, so they took South Africa to one of these courts and to say that we want compensation for having to institute black empowerment policies. Actually, that case was settled out of court, and the Italian company was able to circumvent that ruling, and they didn't have to give that percentage of their company away. And we went to Hamburg, we went to countless countries, and really it was an eye-opening experience, because it showed that there was a system whereby corporations could not only get huge amounts of compensation, we're talking billions of dollars sometimes. There was a famous case in Ecuador where Occidental Petroleum won billions of dollars from the Ecuadorian government, but also it has caused and is causing regulatory and policy making chill around the world, because it's not only the cases that get to court that are important. Many governments now around the world are worried when they're making internal policy making decisions and deliberations about whether they should, I don't know, for example, grant an environmental permit or allow a company to dig for gold in an area where it's going to destroy the environment. A lot of the deliberations now are we going to get taken to one of these courts if we don't grant that permit? And one case in Guatemala, we got through the Freedom of Information Act in Guatemala, we got some internal deliberations they were having about a prospective mine in Guatemala, and this is exactly what they were talking about. And in fact, in the end, they didn't grant the environmental permit to the mining. They did grant the environmental permit to the mining company because they were too worried about getting sued. This system is enshrined through a web of treaties and free trade agreements around the world, and it basically affects nearly every single person on the planet, and it's all done in secret as well. That's the other thing. It's very, very difficult to get documents about this. So we started on that, or looking into that system, and investigated that for 6 months. And then as we were going around, we were noticing that a lot of the countries that were getting hit with these cases were also ensnared in a system, another part of the World Bank, which we looked into, called the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, which was also set up in this same period, post-colonial period, so-called post-colonial period. In 1956, the IFC was set up. And that was about promoting the entry of corporations into the developing world. And it was a Cold War thing as well. They wanted to stop Soviet penetration of the developing world. So they thought one way to do that would be to increase the size of the private sector in these companies and reformulate economies much more along neoliberal lines. So we looked into that for another 6 months, not just the IFC, we looked into the whole aid industry, because aid, again, was developed essentially out of the institutions of former empire. They repackaged a lot of them and said that we are now about development and we want the poor people of the world to develop. Now, what model did they promote for that development was all about greasing the entry of corporations, primarily Western corporations, into those developing worlds. Also, the IFC has an advisory arm, and its advisory arm tells these countries to privatize their industries, deregulate their economies. That's the only way you can develop, etc., etc. So I'll just be quick on this because it's worth getting across the whole thesis of the book. As we were going around looking into the aid industry and how that locked the developing world into corporate-friendly policies, we also kept on seeing special economic zones, which are small. Well, often, sometimes they're not even small, which are areas which are chiseled land, territory, chiseled off from national governments, and they have their whole own regime in terms of investment, taxes, labor laws, and they're effectively corporate utopias, and they're all over the world, and they allow corporations to circumvent national law in a lot of places. They've taken off really in China, actually. That Chinese see the special economic zones as the model which is behind their rise to economic superpower status. Alongside that, there's also another facet of that is the private cities, which are taking off around the world, which are corporate built and corporate owned and corporate run cities. And then obviously you have gated communities and all these different ways that the 1% and the people that are benefiting from this corporate system are locking themselves off from the society, which is becoming increasingly unequal, and obviously all the problems that are attendant to that inequality. They want to lock themselves off from them. So there's all this high degree of there's all this territory which is just separated off from national territory. Then another part of that is you have to defend yourself physically and by force when you're separating yourself off from that society. And so the final chapter is all about the final section is all about private armies and private security, because we were seeing that everywhere we went as well, just the massive advent of companies being in control of the guns and the resort to force, which if you look at the history of political thought and political philosophy, a lot of these kind of theorists have said that the power of the state essentially rests on the fact that it has the legal resort to force and the legal resort to violence. That's now changing. That's now moved over a lot of places over to the corporation. So what does that mean when the state is not in control of the guns? So the final section looks into that and kind of traces it alongside all these other trends that I've talked about. And what you see is that in terms of the coup, in my opinion, this has been a battle that's been happening for 400 years or more than, because the first joint stock company, or the first modern joint stock company, now that's a company which we kind of all know now, which is where has tradable shares and people can invest in a company. The first one, this modern one, historians say was in 1955 in London, in England. And since that time, there's just been a civil rights battle the corporation has been waging against the state to get more and more rights and to gain more and more power over that state. A lot of those battles were won in the 19th century, particularly in the UK and in the United States. But after the Second World War, it was the age of the multinational. That's when the multinational really took off, and this international architecture to enforce corporate control really was the basis of that. And I think that now in 2023, we're kind of at the end of, or I think the coup is nearly complete. I don't think that the state has any power effectively, which is separate from the corporation. I think the corporation obviously has nominal power of the state, but I think a lot of its decisions are being made in the interests of corporations now completely, that they're not representing the people. And I'll just end on this anecdote. One of the things that I asked people, poor people, when I went from Colombia, whether it be peasants in Colombia or farmers, subsistence farmers in Tanzania, I'd often say to them when they were in these battles with corporations because they were getting moved off their land, or they were getting, in the case of Colombia, they were getting killed by paramilitaries or private corporations hired by these companies. I'd say to them, well, what's the government doing for you? Like, the government's it meant to work for you. And every single one would say, no. The government works for the corporation. They don't work for us. And that was across the board. So that's the situation we're in now. We have governments that are working for the corporate sector, not for its people. And that's obviously been the case for a while, but I think that the control now is nearly total.
Yeah, it's really shocking and also just like overwhelming, because your book is a very kind of like around the world type book, literally every continent. And it's just one thing after another. I was really struck by like the idea of democracy on trial. And, I noticed that Stephen Donziger actually blurbed your book, and he's somebody that really applies to in terms of the way he was persecuted. We actually had him on our show recently, and I feel like this was actually a lot of the theme of what we talked about. So I'm sure he like absolutely loved your book. But I'm thank you for breaking down the way that you split it up, and obviously all of these various aspects of this are so important. But there was one in particular that I'm wondering. I'm sure Kevin's going to ask you probably to elaborate on others as well. But one in particular that I wanted you to elaborate on is the sort of like aid and development aspect of all this, and the way that there's this like kind of international, development financing system and international aid system that actually works in tandem with these sort of corporate masters of the universe. And maybe you could talk a bit about some specific examples that you give in the book.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to this actually. Which one of them we don't talk about in the book, and one's more related to what I do in my day job, which is with Declassified UK. And that I'll start with that one, which is that the aid industry is a massive tool for geopolitical control, and they talk about it in those terms in sort of internal documents. So recently, for example, with Declassified, I've done a story about how the UK government spent nearly £500,000 on an anti-government coalition in Venezuela. That was done with public aid money. I did one about an aid program in Brazil, which was about getting Brazil under Bolsonaro to privatize their oil and gas. I did one about, there was a £75 million aid project in Mexico run by the UK, which was about getting UK companies to benefit from the privatization of Pemex, which happened in 2014. So that's obviously the last one is the last two are about corporations, but it's also about exerting control, because it's about getting the UK government as an advisor, getting the UK government interests and close to these governments. The second part is what you talk about, which is the corporate control, and that is how I think that is how aid and the development sector has been from the start, because a lot, as I said previously, a lot of these institutions that are now, particularly I can talk about the UK side, that are now a part of the UK development financing world, came actually out of the formal empire that we had, but they had to repackage it in an age when that wasn't allowed. You weren't allowed to talk in those terms. Empire became a dirty word, so they developed this new language, which was all about helping the developing world, helping end poverty, which is the stated goal of the World Bank, because they needed a new PR campaign. But effectively, what it was always about creating economies which would work in the interests of Western corporations and primarily US and UK corporate power, and that's what you see to this day. I mean, in the US, you have this thing called Tide Aid, where a lot of the aid, or nearly all the aid contracts, go to US companies. It's explicit. And there was a bit of controversy in the UK about that, and then the UK officially untied their aid in the 90s. But again, that didn't really happen, and nearly all the public contracts go to UK companies. So it's about providing a massive subsidy to the private sector, and that is why the right wing promote it. Like, for example, I'll give you an example which I think is quite illustrative. David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the UK from 2010 to 2016, and his Chancellor George Osborne, they enacted an absolutely brutal austerity program in Britain, which they say excess deaths in Britain after that austerity program was over 100,000. Like, it was extremely savage, one of the most savage, punitive attacks on the poor that there's ever been in Britain. At the same time as they were doing that, they were promoting massively that they were going to commit Britain to 0.7% of its GDP for foreign aid. So they were saying, we want to help the poor in the developing world, at the same time as they were hammering the domestic poor. Now, obviously, they didn't care about the poor in the foreign world, but what that 0.7% of GDP constituted was a massive subsidy to their friends in the corporate sector. And that's why they support it. And that is often why all these sort of corporate liberals, corporate Republicans, they all support the foreign aid budget, because it's a massive subsidy to the private sector. And it's also, importantly, about keeping economies working in the interests of corporations, because the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, which were created after the Second World War, the two main parts of that is the World Bank and the IMF. Now, they have a massive role in designing developing world economies around the world. And the policy prescriptions which they give are extremist and became really extreme in the 70s and 80s, in the neoliberal period. There was a debt crisis in Latin America in the 70s, and they leveraged that debt crisis to enact a huge amount of extremist policies, which are called the Washington Consensus. The consensus doesn't go much further than Washington and London, but they called it the Washington Consensus. And what it was about was deregulating your economy, getting rid of capital controls, getting rid of subsidies for anything like food or fuel or anything that would help the poor, and deregulating your economy to allow corporations to enter and run the economy effectively, much easier. And we're still in that stage. Those organizations haven't changed at all. And there was some pushback in the 90s and early 2000s, before September 11th. There was quite a lot of focus on how the Bretton Woods institutions had, and the aid institutions had, after the Second World War, from the 70s, pushed this extremist agenda. There was a famous book by Joseph Stiglitz, who was chief economist at the World Bank, but he came out as a kind of whistleblower and wrote that book, Globalization as Discontents. And he used the word extremist to describe the ideology which had taken hold of the World Bank. But we're still in that period, and the aid organizations are at the forefront, and it's important. I'll finish with this. It's important to note that this is not a perversion of a system which was set up with good intentions. It was always designed like that from the start. And if you look at the declassified documents, or the archival documents, which we did, we went to the World Bank archives in Washington, D.C. They say it openly in those terms. They talk about it, about how they can use it to promote corporate power and promote US geopolitical interests. It's just that this public posture is completely at odds, but that's the one that everyone gets.
Yeah, when I was going through this section of your book, I was struck by something that I know very little about, which is the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition in Africa that you describe as being launched in the 2012 G8 summit by Obama. And you take a look at some of the impact of it. It was condemned as a new form of colonialism. That's how you quoted it in your book. I think in particular, within that framework, I'm interested in hearing you share about going to Tanzania and what you were able to uncover there, especially in the context of the connection with the UK, with the monarchy, with Queen Elizabeth, and also De Beers and the mining operations there. I'll just note that something thematically or something that's in common with a lot of these is that you'll find that there's a mining operation that is central to the push for changing the laws so that these investors have more rights to determine policy in government.
Yeah, I'll start with Tanzania. So Tanzania is quite an interesting case because they had like a extremely sort of well thought of president for 20 years, from the 60s to the mid 80s, called Julius Nyerere, and he's kind of seen as one of the godfathers of African socialism. So they had, but that's been picked apart. His legacy has been destroyed because of these different institutions which have come in after him from the 80s. And so I went there to look at two things. One was a diamond mine, which had been received a big development loan from the IFC, that the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, and the other part was part of the new alliance. They created this new, what they called a corridor, an agrarian corridor, but effectively it was a way of getting corporations into Tanzania, and people were getting kicked off their land. So I went to talk to some communities that were being kicked off their land. So I'll start with the diamond mine, and the diamond mine was pretty eye-opening because for me it's kind of, again, emblematic of how corrupt this whole system is. This is development financing, public money, because the World Bank's publicly funded, that was going to give a non-commercial loan to a company called Petra Diamonds, which is listed in London, to develop and expand their diamond mine in Tanzania. Now, that's not usually what you'd expect aid money to be spent on, but actually it's often is. And their argument was, the diamond mine gives all these benefits to the local community, like jobs, and they invest in schools and hospitals around the site and stuff. Most of that's untrue. The job stuff, there is some truth to it providing jobs. But I went to the diamond mine and I talked to, and it's kind of a very good example of how the geography of corporate rule around the world, because it creates a two-tiered existence. So in Tanzania, which is quite a poor country, you go around. I drove from the airport and you see the poverty all around. Homeless people that can't afford food, and then you arrive at the diamond mine, which they call a campus, and you've got the big imposing metallic gates, and you go through, and then it's perfectly tarmac roads straight away. There's like a school and a hospital that works, and everything's looks really nice, and everyone looks happy. And then you talk to the people, and they're saying, "Oh yeah, well." The people within the mine, the PR people and the finance people, and they're saying, "Oh yeah, we provide all this wonderful stuff to the local community." And they also then say, "Oh yeah, but we needed the World Bank money because we weren't making a profit, and we're not profitable, and we haven't paid." So they hadn't paid tax for over 10 years. So the World Bank's giving money to a non-profitable diamond mine as their development. So anyway, all that, and then the interesting part of it was that they took me to some schools that they'd built around the mine site, not within the campus, but actually like neighboring, and they were really down on their luck facilities. Like the kids packed into like a small brick school that probably cost, I don't know, £5,000 or £10,000 to build, not a lot of money. So, and I actually talked to some teachers away from my PR minders, and they were saying, look, this company doesn't pay any tax in our country. So the central government's getting no revenue from this diamond company. And yet they come and act like they're our saviors by building these really cheap schools. And that is kind of how it works. And that's the whole basis of CSR, corporate social responsibility, which is about promoting this idea that corporations are needed to develop and are providing all these wonderful benefits. The reality is that companies are avoiding and evading paying tax to a central government, leaving governments with the inability to provide any kind of public services for their people, yet acting like the saviors by giving little little bits here and there to local communities. And actually, that was a very conscious move by mining companies, particularly in the 80s, because I previously covered the mining sector for the Financial Times for a year. And one of the things I found when I started looking into it was that in the 80s and 90s, mining companies were having real trouble operating in the developing world because their reputation was so bad, and the reputational issues were meaning that they were getting kicked out, and it was impossible for them to operate in a lot of places. They were losing their quote unquote social license. So corporate social responsibility, the CSR industry, they pump huge amounts of money in to try and launder their reputation and try and provide a way for them to get back into these developing countries and operate freely. And later down the line, this is what this creates. They build these kind of rubbish schools and provide these little crumbs and act like they're the saviors. So there was that, and then another part. The other story I did was about SAGCOT and the New Alliance, and how I went to visit I went deep into like the Tanzanian jungle to talk to some farmers who had been kicked off their land by a company that was benefiting from the New Alliance aid money. And they were just saying, there was no consultation. The company just came and told us that we have to get off our land. And that was another light bulb moment, because you realize that actually these development institutions and this development money, they don't care about what kind of communities they're destroying. They just want to get access to new resources or new land or whatever it is to up their profits. And that was what I was hearing all around the world. They do it all in the name of development, all in the name of aid, all in the name of alleviation of poverty, but it's all empty words. And you see that on the ground, like the people that understand this stuff are the victims, really. Like when I would talk to people in the World Bank and they just regurgitate all the useful ideology and the useful propaganda about what these systems do. But on the ground, people have a much more clear-eyed view of what these systems are because they see the results of them. Whereas the people in Washington are kind of protected from the results. They get their nice reports, which are sanitized back in Washington. So, but Tanzania is one example of a system which is global, and all the diamond mine, the struggle of this local community in Tanzania, they're mirrored in every single country. Those two examples. In Myanmar, we also went to Myanmar, Burma. There was a 5-star hotel being built by the IFC with IFC loans. There was a special economic zone being built by the Japanese aid agency, which is called JICA, called Tilawa, which we went there, and people were being kicked off their land to build this special economic zone. So again, it's just it's global.
I want you to talk about another aspect of this, which is I think this is so fascinating, the issue of like corporate armies. And you go around to a bunch of different places. You also talk about a bit of battle testing in Palestine. You talk about privatizing borders. Can you go into a little bit of that? I mean, I think this is like something that obviously is more prevalent, if not only mostly seen in the global South, though you could maybe make the argument that there's certain parts of the global North where there's private armies here and there, but not quite in the same way. But yeah, talk a bit about that and some of the specific things that you witnessed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge trend. I mean, the interesting thing was that, as you guys will be well aware, that this really became an issue and a mainstream issue during the war in Iraq. Private military companies, particularly Blackwater. I think, the first book I wrote was about the US military. So I did some research on this, and I think that by 2007 or 8, there were more private contractors, US private contractors in Iraq than there were Department of Defense personnel. So, and this became a very mainstream issue, but it kind of has become less mainstream now. But the dynamic hasn't stopped. Now there's private security all around the world, and it's not just ones that are contracted by governments. It's also corporations hiring corporate armies and corporate security to guard their sites. So And also we're at the start of this. This is a part of this story, the coup, that is kind of the most recent one. And there's no regulation on this at all. There's zero regulation. There's voluntary agreements that most of these companies sign up to, but they're not binding. So it's a complete Wild West industry. And I can talk particularly about one case which you mentioned, which was Palestine and Israel. Now, I went there in 2016 and did a lot of research about how the Israelis that were privatizing the occupation of the West Bank. And we went to checkpoints and we'd see that they were being manned not by the so-called IDF, but by a private company called, I think it was Modin Ezrachi or something like that. I can't remember the proper name, but effectively these were people that were involved in shootings. We looked into a case where they killed Palestinians, and the Palestinian families have been trying to get information about what had happened to their family members, and they couldn't at all, because one facet of this is that governments want to privatize the security apparatus because it is a level of accountability that is much lower for corporations than governments. So it's virtually impossible to get any information about what happened in that case, but also across the board. So that was one trend. The other is that it's increasingly difficult for people on the ground to know what security force they're dealing with. Like I talked to a Palestinian investigator who was in Ramallah, and he was talking about how now there were so many different companies and different uniforms that it was impossible for him to really locate who each crime that he was looking to, who had done what. And I think that's another part of it as well. You can disperse accountability. In Colombia, I went to there to look into a case that had been that's quite famous, about Chiquita, the banana company, formerly called United Fruit. They changed their name because they became known for overthrowing governments and other bad stuff. But they had hired paramilitaries to or paid paramilitaries in Colombia to take out opponents of their projects, and also to take out trade unionists and other people. And that actually was a case that was being heard in the United States under the Alien Tort Statute. And that, again, is another part of this. That was a company hiring other private interests to carry out their work. And that, again, is all over the world, because there's no accountability. That is my personal take is that's why they love it. In El Salvador, I mentioned at the start, the mining company that had sued the El Salvadorans for at this court. A lot of opponents of that mine, or some opponents of that mine, had been killed, but they couldn't track who had any kind of accountability, and we saw that all over the world. It's very rare that you get any accountability for the murder of opponents of these resource projects, and part of that is because they hire private interests to do it. And I think going forward, that it's going to be one of the major problems we face. Anyone who believes in democracy or an engaged citizenry, because with no regulation and corporations increasingly control of the political system, there's nothing to say that corporations can't just have their own official armies, or have and then they might go to war with each other. There might be a Coca-Cola v Pepsi war over in Colombia over a resource. Sounds mad, yeah. But there's nothing to stop that happening. And the only reason I think that it hasn't happened yet is because, as I say, this is a trend that has started a bit later than the other ones I've discussed. And for me, it's the scariest part of the whole thing, because I don't think there's any will in the political system or any mechanism really anymore for the political system to stop this. There's been various attempts to regulate private militaries, which have been killed by the US or the UK. It's interesting now because they talk like one of the big. We can talk in sort of open and serious terms about the problem with Wagner Group, right, with Russia. Everyone talks about how that allows the Putin regime to escape accountability. But we can't talk about it when we talk about our own private military companies, which is all the same problems. So, I mean, the Wagner Group is a problem. They have very little accountability, but what we have is much more serious in terms of the power that it can project.
Yeah, and when you think of the loss of public space as a result of this privatization, the powers that are being extended to police in order to help and enable this securitization, and part of this section of your book is just in general the rise of the private security industry with G4S and just, you know, going to an office building or going to a complex and seeing a security guard there, and also the proliferation of these jobs, just like as a thing that people do as employment. If you go back 25, 30 years, this was not as popular of a job as it is now to just have guards there at all of these places. So I think that's important. You know, we're coming to the end of our show, and connected to this, I'd like to raise just a couple things that are happening where you are in the UK. If you don't mind, it's a little bit away from your book Status Coup, but I'm pretty, Silent Coup. Status Coup is another show. Silent Coup is your book. And the fact that the counterterrorism police, the British counterterrorism police, detained Kit Clarenberg, who had been a guest on our show previously, who we talked to about the reporting that it seems he's been targeted for in the UK, this Schedule 3 law that's in the 2019 terrorism law, but then there's also Schedule 7 under the 2000 terrorism law, the way that this has been abused. Recently, it was also abused in detaining Ernest Murray, who is a French publisher who had come to London for a book festival. And just what this means in the context of the fact that Julian Assange is still detained in the high security prison in Belmarsh. And then now you see the Metropolitan Police have apparently been sending notices to people who the FBI still wants to have questioned in relation to the case, despite the fact that there's this global pressure, despite some of the actions we've seen unfolding in Australia within the government, which has been remarkable. And that, you know, Andrew O'Hagan, right, was a ghostwriter that worked with Assange. They had a falling out. It wasn't a great working relationship. It didn't really produce an autobiography that Assange approved, but he's in total solidarity with Julian. He says that he would not give any information to the FBI. He will not cooperate. But we do see the Metropolitan Police in the UK working on behalf of the US to still investigate, even though they already issued an indictment.
Yeah, I mean, everything you've outlined there is really an illustration of something really quite sinister, which is happening in the UK. And I think the UK uniquely is pushing to clamp down on freedom of the press, free speech, freedom to protest, because another element of this, which you haven't mentioned, which is that there's been all these draconian pieces of legislation passed to stop protests, particularly aimed at Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and climate change protesters. What is more sinister for me is the lack of coverage this gets in the media, because I think that is really illustrative of what the media's role is in Britain, because a lot of these things that are outrageous and are clamping down on our freedoms and effectively erasing our freedoms here would not happen if they were problematized by the media, but they're not at all. Assange is for me the illustrative case, because he has been in Belmarsh Maximum Security Prison in London now for over 4 years. And there hasn't been one single investigation in the British mainstream media about the legal case around him or anything that happened to him before he went into Belmarsh in the Ecuadorian embassy. This is despite a huge secret police operation called it was police operation and intelligence operation against him, which we've done quite a lot of work on at Declassified. And obviously the fact that he's now in a British maximum security prison, you would think that the British media might be interested in it. And we've published countless investigations of this case at Declassified. And I think if any of those had been published, or some of those have been published in the mainstream media, there would have been a political reaction, or there would have been pressure on the political system to either explain it and then maybe solve it. But they've got away with it because it's completely pushed under the rug. I don't know if you saw recently, but the one of the central people at Reporters Without Borders, Rebecca Vincent, tried to go to Belmarsh and was not even allowed in. This is and she said publicly that she's had more trouble accessing the legal cases around the hearings around Assange and obviously him inside Belmarsh than she has in places like Erdogan's Turkey, and that stuff hasn't even been reported in the mainstream media.
And sorry to interrupt you, but can I steer you to why we don't have an appeal ruling from the High Court of Justice yet? I'm just wondering, since you're actually from the country, why we could go almost a year without somebody getting an answer from this court.
I don't know. It's completely mad to me. Obviously we all come up with theories in the absence of any hard evidence, but one of them was I was thinking that maybe something is being negotiated in the background and they're trying to delay just enough time that they can then just spring him and send him to Australia or whatever that agreement would be. Because I can't understand it. It's completely mad. Like he's been there for 4 years now as a remand prisoner. He's not convicted of anything. So I can't help you. I don't know what the lawyers are saying. I mean, I think that to move forward now, I think they have to grant him an appeal. Although I don't have any trust in the legal system here in this case. Because it's been shown to be completely corrupted and completely irregular what they do. But I think for public relations purposes, they're going to have to grant him appeal because obviously he won the original ruling, and then that was reversed at appeal by the US appeal. So they're going to have to allow him to then appeal the original ruling. But they might not. But if they do, I think that then happens, and then that will be another 6 months down the line, maybe. And then if that gets rejected, then it'll have to then he can go to the European Court of Human Rights, which can give a ruling, but doesn't have to be applied by the UK courts. It's an advisory. But I mean, I think I don't know what to think because I always think, okay, maybe there's something going on in the background that this is embarrassing for the US and particularly the UK. But then you hear, as you mentioned in your introduction there to this subject, you mentioned the new FBI probe into Assange. That seems to me to be a signal from the US, because Andrew O'Hagan is a bit part player, I imagine, from that time. He was ghostwriting a autobiography, but he wasn't involved, I don't think, in the releases around the cables. So why would they suddenly want evidence from him now? So to me, it's a signal to say, look, we're still pursuing this. So that kind of goes against what we've been hearing from the Australian government and Assange's lawyers. But so I don't really understand what's going on. I think that underneath it all, I think that the US is does want a resolution that doesn't involve him going to the US, because I just think that the circus around him ending up in the US would just be so bad for the US internationally. It's becoming a problem for them to project power internationally anyway, because if they ever talk about press freedom now, it's the same with the UK government. They just get trolled into oblivion by people posting pictures of Assange getting hauled out of the Ecuadorian embassy. And fair enough, it is a complete contradiction of what they say, but that's part of it. but there is elements within the US state and in the blob that are powerful, that are just that, and they're people that are just saying, look, he went too far, and we're not going to let him go. And it seems like at the moment, those people, those hardliners within the intelligence establishment, are winning, and maybe will win in the end. And I think with the Trump, it came out, didn't it, with the Trump pardoning at the end of his term, that he wanted to pardon Assange, but was told by some scary people in the intelligence establishment, look, you will never be able to run again. We will stop you doing anything if you pardon Assange. So obviously, there's elements within the US state that are just not going to let this go.
Well, on that note, I actually do want to ask another question, but I have to can I ask it and then?
Why don't you
I have one
bolt,
last question.
and then I'll get his answer, and then we'll wind this down.
Because I'm curious, when we talk about this sort of silent coup, this corporate coup around the world, how do you place this in the context of these geopolitical rivalries? Like, we have this Cold War taking place right now. The US is escalating against China, and you actually have an increasing number of these countries in the global south that are forming alliances with one another, basically out of just common grievances, because they're either sanctioned by the US or they're targeted in some way by the US. And then you've also got, these new economic blocs forming, such as BRICS, for example, which of course includes countries like India, which is very close to the US, but as well as a lot of countries that aren't, right? So like Russia and China. And then, South Africa, which is kind of goes both ways. But regardless, we do seem to be witnessing a changing or very slowly shifting global order right now, where there's more than one pole of power. People like to refer to this as multipolarity, as I'm sure you know. So I'm just curious, how do you place all of this in the context of an increasingly multipolar world? And do you think in some ways a multipolar world, even if it's not capitalism versus communism like in the past, could actually be perhaps beneficial to I guess, taking away some of that global corporate power? That's a tough question.
It's a good question, and I think that it's the only hope we have is a multipolar world, and that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be a supporter of either side. I think that when you have a multipolar world, it gives the developing world, or leaders in the developing world and movements, the option of organizing around different poles, and gives them an option of being independent. And you've seen that in Latin America with Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador. I don't think that those countries could have survived, and their progressive governments could have survived as long if they hadn't had China to help them economically and geopolitically. And that has implications for corporate power, obviously, because if you want to escape the Western enforced and Western ruled corporate system, if you've got another pole to organize around, you can do that, and you can be independent. The interesting thing is that you mentioned it's not communism v capitalism, and that is an interesting facet of this, because we went to China for the book as well. We went to Shenzhen, which is its flagship special economic zone, opened in 1980 by Deng Xiaoping. And China is hyper-capitalist, more so like this in Shenzhen. It's insane. Like, workers have no rights. Corporations run rampant. The only role for the state is just as a surveillance tool for the corporations. So there's no model that is different to the corporate system, and the corporations have infested the communist world. And actually, the special economic zone was a really useful invention for the Chinese Communist Party, because what it allowed was to have hyper-capitalism, but in very defined areas. So the Communist Party could control the state and maintain control of the state while developing the private sector and its these hyper-capitalist corporate utopias around the country. And I think that's probably going to happen in other authoritarian regimes. But I think that the move to the multipolar world is a whatever those two poles are, is a good thing, because it means when independent, anti-corporate, pro-democracy resource nationalism governments come to power, they have two options that they can play off each other. One interesting part of that example of that is Bolivia under Evo Morales, which allied heavily with the Chinese actually, and was able to get huge amounts of investment and was able to survive while it was doing really radical anti-corporate policies. It renegotiated lots of contracts. I interviewed Evo Morales and he said that previously it was 12% for the Bolivians and 88% for the corporations. He reversed that, and that's 88% for the Bolivians and 12% for the corporations. He did that. He also nationalized huge amounts of companies, and was taken to one of these courts as well, actually, as all these people are when you do that kind of thing. But they survived. And also there was a CIA UK-backed coup in 2019. They came back the next year. Democracy was restored. So would that have happened in a non-multipolar world? Probably not. The 90s were dominated. The Soviet Union had gone, and the 90s were a pretty bleak time for the left globally. But but I think that's changing, and I think that is something to be welcomed. And I think that is why you see such a huge propaganda campaign against China, particularly now. It's the new enemy, and it's going to be the new enemy. And it's not a new enemy because it's a new threat. It's a new enemy because it's a new threat to the establishment, and it's a new threat to the 1% in the West. It's not a threat to us in the same way. And I'll just finish with this. One of the interesting parts of this is that the corporate sector is actually at odds with the national security state over China, or has been. So I mentioned the David Cameron, George Osborne government in the UK, which began in 2010. They were hugely in favor of China. George Osborne even went to, I can't say it now, but the province where, I can't say it because my pronunciation's bad, but the province where there's apparently been this Uyghur genocide, right? He was there in 2015. He went to drum up business, promote and spoke lovingly of the Chinese. That has now completely, and at that point the business community was massively promoting it, because obviously you want to be it's a huge market. It's going to be the economic superpower for, I don't know, the next 100 years or maybe more. Why would you want to be at war with it? And the business community knew that. But the national security state, the securocrats, were always saying, well, this is a threat to our hegemony. And actually, in the UK particularly, that all flipped. So the power of the business community in terms of the balance with the securocrats flipped during COVID, really. And COVID, since COVID and during COVID, China is now designated often the main security threat for Britain. And Liz Truss actually who was the Prime Minister for about a week in the UK, she wanted to designate them an official enemy. So the rhetoric is trumpeted up, but it's actually an example of the security state outgunning the business community, and it doesn't happen very often. It's just that in the US with Cuba, that's another example where the security state has kind of outgunned the business community. Would love to get into Cuba, but the security state has always won that battle. But they're few and far between, those ones. But it does seem now that we're entering a new Cold War, and it's going to be bad for everyone, including the 1%.
All right, Matt, thank you for joining us. I'm going to put your book back on the screen. It's Silent Coup, How Corporations Overthrew Democracy, co-authored by you and Claire Provost. It's excellent work. Why don't you tell people where you would like them to buy it, if you have a preferred place for them to go, and then where they can find your work.
Yeah, you can buy the book. Probably the best place to buy it is on Bloomsbury's website. I can't remember. I think it's bloomsbury.com. And then you can read my work, but also the work of my colleagues at declassifieduk.org. And we do cover a lot of this stuff in terms of aid and corporate power, because the UK is a huge corporate power around the world. We've got massive multinational companies like BAE Systems, BP, HSBC, which are British. So I'd say people go there, and check out independent media like this show.